most evenings it's the audience that's in danger of going to sleep. But this is one time where the speaker is also in some danger. If I do go to sleep, throw something at me. Basically, I just traveled all the way from India and I have a few hours to go and I'm going back tomorrow morning. But the reason I'm here is a good enough reason to have made this long trip. I'm a great believer that it's necessary to lend your shoulder to good causes, whatever the nature of the cause is, because I find that good people are always struggling to find the resource, the muscle, the resource to keep doing the work they need to do. The reason I'm really here is out of friendship for Rashid Bhai and his cause and what he does. And I can tell you, I really believe in the sort of work that he is doing. I know that essentially it's because in another way Tehilka does exactly the same. There is the business of feeding children in slums and looking after, the destitute of the world. But people who understand the nature of the world, people who understand the nature of power, people who understand the way the world functions, know that the most important thing to do is to be able to influence and move the levers of power. It's to influence policy, it's to influence governments. That's what works in the big multipliers that brings change. The soft option always is to feed the poor man outside your door. The tough option is to put your life on the line for the big battles which feed not one or two children, but which feed millions of children, which make an impact and a difference not to one or two people, but to millions of people. And even when I look at the kind of journalism that's practiced, not just in India but across the world, I judge the quality of the journalist or the journalism they practice by the risks they take. And the time when you really take a risk is when you array yourself against powers that can hurt you, when you commit yourself to actually impacting and influencing power at its highest level, because the multiplier that it sets into motion is what you really need, not just the feeding. I'm not knocking the feeding of destitutes and looking after slums. It's very valuable and I wish more people did it. But I think equally important, and in many ways far more important, is stuff like what IMC is trying to do, which is trying to impact policy, because the multiplier effect that has is way beyond anything individuals can achieve. As the gentleman speaking before me said, governments have resources and power that exceeds anything we can ever match. We need to activate them to do the right thing. I'll start with a small story. A year ago at a private dinner in Delhi, Indra Nui was speaking, the boss of Pepsi. And Indra Nui told us a story at this sit-down dinner at the cabinet minister's house. She said that in Pepsi, 8-9 years ago, I think she said 1999, she said they had a kind of tradition in which they invite a senator to come and address the top brass of Pepsi on the great global trends of the coming years. The idea, of course, is that Pepsi should know where it can make more money. She said in the 1999 session, there was a senator, she didn't name the senator because he said it's always confidential, who came and addressed them for 2 hours on the global trends that will emerge in the coming decade. That's the decade that we're living through now. At the end of the 2-hour talk, Indra said she stood up and asked the senator why he had left out India altogether. And the senator actually said, because India doesn't matter. It's too big, it's too chaotic, it doesn't really matter, it's not going to matter in the future. She said 3 years ago, that's in 2004, the same senator happened to come again for a similar session. And she said this time he started with India and almost 35 minutes out of the 2 hours were spent on talking about India and how important it was. I think the idea she was trying to make, the point that she was trying to make was that India had come to occupy a preeminent place in the world, and what India did was becoming more and more important. I'll tell you another story. 6 months ago, Tehilka carried out a sting investigation in Gujarat, which lasted 6 months. In March 2007, I sent a very good reporter from Tehilka called Ashish Ketan. He was based in Bombay. He'd done some great work with us, including a very important expose 3 years ago on the changing testimony of Zahira Sheikh. Zahira Sheikh had changed the testimony 3 times. The 3rd time she flipped the testimony, I sent the reporter to Ahmedabad. I said, go and sit down there and find out what's happening. Clearly something's wrong. Eventually, he nailed the crime on camera. He got Madhu Srivastava, who had paid, the BJP MLA who had paid Zahid Sheikh 18 lakh rupees to change the testimony on camera, admitting to it, and it led to a Supreme Court intervention and action. So there was a case in Vadodara in March, April 2007, where a particular exhibition had been vandalized by right-wing Hindu zealots. I said this guy, I said, just go to Vadodara and see what's happening. I just want to understand, is this a kind of spontaneous outburst of anger that happens, or is there an organized thing to this kind of constant attacks on anything that is remotely secular or seemingly anti-Hindu? This boy went to Gujarat, to Vadodara. He called me back 4 days later and he said, Tarun, the story I'm getting is something else altogether. There is this story, but I've actually come around to some people who are beginning to tell me things about the 2002 killings. I told him, I said, drop everything else. This is the only story you will pursue now till it's done. For the next 6 months, single-handedly pursued this story all over Gujarat. It required immense courage. His life was at risk at all times. We had worked out a modus operandi. Before he went to meet a particular person for a sting, he would call the investigations editor, Harinder Baveja at the Helga. He would tell her where he was going. She would let me know. She would SMS it to me. When he came back, he would let us know. We were worried for his life. But as it turned out, he ran through the entire 6 months without really running into trouble except once. And he put together this most extraordinary investigation. I remember we called it the most important story of our time. For my money, in my 24 years in the business of journalism, this was the single most important story I've been part of. Far more important than match fixing in cricket, far more important than the big story that ruined us last time around, Operation West End, which was about procurement, corruption in the procurement of arms. So there's the Gujarat expose. The fact of the expose was far less important than what happened after we came out with the expose. We broke the story on the national networks. It was an archduck in great detail. We showed the footage. And this footage was really revealing footage. This footage was of people who had actually killed. I think this was the first time in the history of world media that you had mass murderers confessing to their murder in great detail live on camera. We had this on the national networks. But the amazing thing about it was, despite that, almost nothing happened. I mean, and this for me was the most frightening thing. Not that the killings had taken place, but the fact that even after they'd been exposed, the Indian state was so slow to respond. And in some peculiar way, many of us who live and work in India have become inured to this kind of apathy. I was a very young reporter in 1984 when we saw the anti-Sikh riots. In many ways, they were even crazier than the Gujarat riots because the anti-Sikh riots took place in the capital of India. They didn't take place in Ahmedabad and Vadodara. They took place in Delhi. I mean, it's the seat of the Indian state. It's the seat of power. I mean, they could have been stopped. We know they could have been stopped in 1 hour, but they were not. And more than 3,000 Sikhs were killed in a completely arbitrary assault in 1984. So there is this kind of inurement that we have. Even so, each time it happens, it sets us back a little to wondering that the Indian state that Indra Nooyi saw as this great shining state, that many of us do see as a great shining state, is it truly a shining state, or is it still a state bedeviled with great medieval problems on which we don't seem to be getting a handle? So, is India shining? Or is India actually declining? I mean, that's the big question that seems to be posed to us all the time these days. And there again, I'll make a clarification. It's not posed at all quarters, it's posed in certain quarters. For a certain section of Indians today, India is shining and there is no question about it. I mean, and across the world in different forums, and I end up going to many of these forums, I find I'm the lone dissenting voice which is just trying to flag the issue and say, it's true, the economic efflorescence is true, it is legitimate, the fact that there is a great economic energy in India is true and legitimate, there is no question about it, but there is also another story. That is only part of the story. There is a far more complex and complicated story, and we need to understand what this complex and complicated story is. Statistics reveal actually that the poverty levels in India have not really gone down. We are still talking about close to 700 million people who live in great destitution. Almost 320 million of these live on less than $0.50 a day. Many of these people have tens of millions have no access to education, no access to health, no access to any opportunity in life. The big story, the economic boom story concerns maybe 100 to 200 million people, but we are 1,150 million people in India. There is a vast tranche of people who are outside the great development and economic story of India, and that is borne out by statistics. There was a recent survey of some months ago, 6 months ago, which showed that in the 5 biggest states in India, the actual numbers of people living below poverty line has gone up. Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Maharashtra, UP and Bihar. The actual numbers have gone up. This at the time when we are being told again and again about the great superpower India is and how India is booming. It's a complex story. You have Gujarat, you have massacres in Gujarat, so you have this incredible mix of technological excellence. It's like when I got a cab yesterday in New York at last night. An Italian boy got into the cab with me. Like all Italians, he was smart and smooth, and he said that he cut half his price to Manhattan by riding the cab with me. And the moment he got to know from India, he said, software, you guys are the big tech superpower. So you have this at the same time, this global reputation of being a great superpower, this fantastic gathering here with all these wonderfully successful people. And at the same time, you have medieval atrocities, you have medieval problems that really dog you in a very deep way. And some days I feel that we are like America was in the Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age at the turn of the last century, there was this great sense of euphoria about America when the robber barons were making the money and the rest of the society would catch up. And there were this, people were partying and there was glamour and there was money on display and everybody was living outsized. But also the ground was moving beneath your feet, which ended up with the Depression in 1930. In India, very often I feel that is the case, that we are all in a kind of frenzy about the new economic success that has come to all of us, and we don't see that there is the ground that is moving beneath our feet all the time. And the media, unfortunately, and I'm going to be a little tough on my own colleagues and my own profession, the media in some way has become a part of this great feel-good orgy. If you look at the Indian newspapers, if you look at the mainline English newspapers in India, the mainline Indian press, you will see just an endless amount of feel-good stories, very little soul-searching or deep analysis about the questions that should be dogging mainline media, but a lot of feel-good stuff. In fact, the big joke in India is that the 3 C's are all that concern India: cricket, crime, and cinema. These are the 3 big things that dominate Indian media. So you open the pages, these days it's the IPL. So the IPL gets the Indian Players League, the Premier League, that's the Cricket League. It gets 3 to 4 broadsheet pages every day in your daily newspaper. Cinema is page 1. But I can tell you, 3 years ago, there was a slum clearance drive in Delhi. 260,000 slum dwellers were turfed out of places they've lived in for the last 30 years, in slums they've lived in. Their entire ecosystems, their children, their families, their wives, their jobs, were all linked to this little place they lived in. But if you read the mainline English newspapers in Delhi, you would not know that this had happened. That 260,000 people have been cleared out. And the reason the media barons will give you, the reason editors will give you is that these are not our readers. We cover what concerns our readers, and slum dwellers don't read English newspapers. So there's a kind of dangerous disjunction building up where corporate interests, political interests, and media interests are slowly closing in and closing up, and a lot of what should be really important is being left out of public discourse because it's not even being reflected by the media in public discourse. And the International Herald Tribune recently did a big piece on Tehelka. They did a long piece on Tehelka. And one of the things the International Herald Tribune's piece said, that Tehelka was the odd publication in India which was swimming against the tide and which was bringing bad news to its readers. And the piece ended up saying, it's a real toss-up whether this particular publication will survive at all. Because Indian media today is so awash with feel-good news that nobody wants bad news. It's the obvious psychology of the well-heeled person. They do not want to see the beggar outside the window, and that has become, unfortunately, the psychology of Indian media too. And when I was a young journalist in the early 80s, I remember all the newspaper groups used to have a rural bureau. So you had a rural bureau which covered rural affairs. Today, when Indian media has more money than it ever imagined it could, where salaries have gone to levels that none of us ever imagined they would. Today, almost no major publication has a rural bureau. And the entire rural stories of India are pretty much blanked out of the Indian press. This is at the time when still 65% of India's population lives in the rural areas and actually pretty much determines political affairs still. The one frightening thing that's happened with media is that there's been a death. I was speaking to the gentleman sitting next to me there. There is a kind of death of outrage. You know, we've lost the ability to be outraged, and that particular issue is directly connected again with the Gujarat story of 2002. Indians have become so thick-skinned, we have become so inured to tragedy, to crime, to violence, and this is in direct contrast to our self-image. You know, we think we are a non-violent people, we think we are an extremely peace-loving and tolerant people. It's not true. Let me tell you, it's not true. If you see what's happening in India today, the levels of violence are actually growing year on year. I mean, the crime, the violence, the ensuing battles between groups are actually growing year on year. We are not a non-violent people, we are not a tolerant people. And the problem now is that we also lost a sense of moral outrage. We do not get outraged. I mean, a story like Gujarat should have outraged us till we got some justice. It did not happen. People are quite happy to look the other way and go on. People are quite happy to see a kind of hyper-reality playing itself out on television and carry on with their lives. And this is something that needs to worry us. This is something the media needs to think about, because we've been ratcheting up the noise on the media so much that now suddenly no one's listening anymore. So you have murders, you have killings. Even as I speak, there's a big butcher agitation going on in India. Pretty much jammed Delhi, jammed Rajasthan, where the Gujars are asking for scheduled caste rights, which itself is another irony and another story to go into. But in a sense, there is this kind of paradox of plenty in media. Lots of media, narrower and lesser and smaller concerns all the time. I'll tell you another story of which illustrates what's going wrong in India. There's a man called Dr. Binayak Sen. Has anybody heard of him here? Yes. Okay. Dr. Binayak Sen's story, where shall I begin? Okay, let me start from where we picked it up. Telka did a big cover story on Dr. Binayak Sen about 5 months ago, and we called it No Country for Good Men. Dr. Binayak Sen's story is that he's an outstanding doctor from CMC Vellore, the Christian Medical College Vellore. He was on the admission of his own batchmates, the finest and the most brilliant of his batch. Instead of taking up a corporate job, instead of going and starting a kind of medical business of his own and making money, Dr. Binayak Sen chose to go and work among the poorest of the poor in Chhattisgarh, now Chhattisgarh, erstwhile Madhya Pradesh. 16 months ago, the Chhattisgarh police picked him up and locked him up as an Naxalite sympathizer. Dr. Binayak Sen has been now in jail for 16 months on completely fraudulent charges. After Tehilkar did this big story on him exposing their wrongs, I wrote a personal letter to all the judges of the Supreme Court, I wrote a personal letter to Sonia Gandhi, I wrote a personal letter to the Prime Minister, I wrote to everybody asking them to intervene. There was nothing. Dr. Binayak Sen is still in prison. Just last week, 25 Nobel laureates have written a letter asking for him to be released. But this is how India can work. And if you read the statute under which Dr. Binayak Sen has been arrested, under that statute, you and I could be arrested for violating the statute. Even to think of an act of terror as the police or the law enforcer imagines it is enough to pick you up and put you in jail. This is a man who has spent 30 years of his life working among the poorest of the poor. He's a true hero. I mean, not Shah Rukh Khan or Amitabh Bachchan, but a man like Dr. Binayak Sen is a true hero. He works for the most wretched of the world. And he, at this moment in time, is in prison for the last 15 months. When my reporter met him, and Tehilkar's reporter met him at the courts when he was being presented, the man was still full of a kind of Gandhian grace. He said that there had been, he even then spoke about constitution and constitutional provisions. He exhibited no anger or bitterness. His mate said that at one point they had decided Dr. Binayak Singh's mates in Chhattisgarh said that they were so outraged by what was happening with Dr. Binayak Singh that they had decided that they would storm the jail and free Binayak Singh. And you know what they told my reporter? They said, but when we thought about it, we said, if we storm the jail and open it up, everyone else will run away except Dr. Binayak Singh, because he will not break the law. I mean, that's the grace of the man even now. I attended a protest rally for Binayak Singh last year. This is another, it's an illustrative of the kind of psychosis that's dominating India. This was held in the Supreme Court hall, this particular protest rally. Several of us were speaking there. Aruna Roy, the great warrior, she was there speaking. A.B. Bardhan of the left, he was speaking. A.B. Bardhan was speaking before me, the left leader, the CPI leader. And A.B. Bardhan said that they had brought this protest rally from Chhattisgarh to Delhi, to the Supreme Court, because they wanted the national press and the country to hear what they had to say about Binayak Singh. I spoke right after Dr. Bardhan, and I said, I asked the hall, it was a packed hall, I asked by name, I named all the big media groups of Delhi, Times of India, Hindustan Times, all the TV channels, everybody. I said, if there's anyone from any of these publications or channels, please stand up. There was not a single representative of any news media in that protest hall that day. It's just, I'm just again going to express to you the fact that there is a complete mismatch of priorities in India today. Just as the Gujarat story will not be taken to its logical end by the media and by civil society, Dr. Binayak Singh's story also flounders trying to find traction in the media. And the truth of the matter today is that unless you can make a certain amount create a certain amount of momentum in national media, anywhere, it's the same in the US, it's become exactly the same in India, you cannot get governments to act, you cannot get policymakers to change, you cannot get things to happen. Soon after this particular expose of ours about Binayak Singh, it's not about Binayak Singh, I'm just trying to use him as an example. I was at a dinner for a group of people coming from the Brookings Institute at the Election Commissioner's house in Delhi. My wife and I reached late because I had to put my magazine to bed. So we were sitting alone on a table like this and having a dinner quickly because everybody had almost left, and this very dapper man walked up to me and he said, I just want to shake your hand and congratulate you because I'm a great admirer of yours and the great work you do for India. So I stood up and I said, and what is your name? And he said, his name is Gopal Subramanian. I immediately caught his hand and I dragged him aside. I said, how could you do that to Binayak Singh? This man, the man who had come to congratulate me, is the Additional Solicitor General of India, who had argued in the Supreme Court against granting Binayak Singh bail. This is the kind of hypocrisy that dominates us. So there will be people who will tell you certain things in public life or in private life and do exactly the opposite when it comes down the line and when the chips fall. India, I have to say, the state in India is increasingly at war against its own people. The good news is that it's not just Muslims who need to feel insecure. I mean, the good news is that there are Dalits, there are tribals. I mean, there is a whole bunch of groupings that are in some sense oppressed in different ways. And I can tell you, and I'm not saying this because I hate the politics of victimhood. I don't think anyone should practice the politics of victimhood. India is a free country. It is incumbent upon us to stand up and demand our rights and get them. I mean, that's the beauty of the foundational principle of the country. But if I were a Muslim in India, it would worry me. Because the kind of psychosis, the kind of miasma is created. You know, every time there's an attack, like in Jaipur recently, when the Jaipur blast took place, I just kept telling my friends, I said, I would hate to be a Muslim in India today. And it's exactly the way it was in the 1980s with the Sikhs. I remember I stopped going out to dinners with my family because I'm a Punjabi, I come from the Punjab. So I grew up all over because my father was in the army. I stopped going out for dinners because of this kind of anti-Sikh poison that had been put into the bloodstream of everyone for those few years. And it's a psychosis, it's a miasma, it doesn't state itself very clearly. But people are just put on the back foot because of it. But as I said, it's not just the Muslims. There are other groups. There are 200 million Dalits who are still fighting a centuries-old battle for some kind of equal footing. There are the tribals who are really getting displaced and who are in some sense now the real fueling force between the growing Naxalite violence. Today 30% of India's districts are witnessing Naxalite violence. And this is not the violence of the well-heeled, this is not the violence of my class of people of the 1960s who took to it out of ideological reasons. This is the violence of the desperate. This is the violence of people who will push to the brink. These are poor people who will push to the brink and have no choice but to pick up arms. Which is why people like me have a problem when the Prime Minister of India, who is basically a good man, defines the Naxalite problem as a great threat to India. It's not a threat. These are your own people. You cannot treat them like criminals. You have to somewhere begin to understand what is it that is leading these incredibly poor people to take up arms and to resort to violence of this kind. And the reason really is that the tribal lands that all these people sit in, the Adivasis, the tribals, it is mineral-rich land. And all those mines, all those lands are today coveted by corporate groups and have been slowly taken over by corporate groups. The forests, the mines, these are all being taken, all the lands are all being taken over by corporate groups, pushing the people to the brink. So the people are then taking up arms. It's almost difficult, even for someone like you who is an utter believer in non-violence, it's almost difficult to fault people like these who push to the brink the way these people have been. I had an opportunity to speak to Rahul Gandhi some months ago, and I told him one thing which I don't know whether he took away or not at all. And that is again connected to exactly what I've been talking about. The problem in India has become that the master narrative of India today concerns no more than 200 or 300 million people. The master narrative of India, of developing India, progressive India, shining India, technological India, democratic India, the master narrative only concerns 200, 300 million people. When we became independent in 1947 and we were only about 330 million people, the master narrative was common for everybody. Everybody was moving in the same direction and looking at the same sort of, the same screen of hope. But today it's not true at all. Today there are 200-300 million people whose narrative is the master narrative, and then there are another 600 to 800 million people who are completely outside this story. If you travel, if any of you travel, and I told this to Rahul Gandhi, I said, if you travel, and he does it all the time, I can see that now, if you travel to Bihar or UP for even 3 hours, you will know that the problems of India cannot be solved out in the next 30 years. But even so, there can be a kind of hope. There can be a kind of affirmation. There can be a kind of unity of purpose to the nation. And I think that's what we are missing out on. We don't have a language that's creating it at all. The master narrative of India really needs to be altered. It needs a kind of language to alter it, and that's not happening at this moment. You know, it's very sexy and trendy to pillory and attack the BJP, particularly in forums like this, and the right-wing Hindus. But that's easy. I can tell you my problems are not with the BJP. My problems are really with the Congress, and I've written about them. The BJP is a known animal. It's bigotry. We know it's bigotry. And we can attack its bigotry. We can see its bigotry. The problem in India has become the Congress. The problem is that for 100 years, the Congress was the umbrella, the great umbrella for the liberals of India, for the secular liberals of India. Today, we don't know what the Congress represents anymore. It's become this amorphous beast. We don't know where it is. Look at what it did in Gujarat. It chose to play a kind of soft, dangerous Hindu card itself, rather than confront directly the whole menace of bigotry and communalism. And this it does again and again. The Prime Minister, the last time with the Prime Minister, Tony kept telling me, he said, I'm terrified of communalism in this country now. I don't know where it's going to take us. But nobody has the nerve to actually stand up. And the Congress itself, the Congress is a big, sprawling beast. It has a it's almost an uncontrollable beast, and it works at different levels. I will say that Sonia Gandhi, whatever little I say of Rahul Gandhi, these are people who very strongly believe in the Nehruvian idea of India, and they should. It's their great-grandfather's idea. Just as people like me believe in that idea, the idea of Nehruvian India. But the Congress as a whole, as a party, doesn't? I'm not sure at all. Does it believe in anything else except the expediency of seizing power? I'm not sure at all. So the problem in India is not just, as I said, the BJP which we can recognize and we can combat. The problem is really the Congress, which should be an ally of every liberal secular person in the country, but is not. The problem is with people like you and me. That's like people like you and me back at home. And again, this is an issue over which I have constant dinner battles with all my friends. Because at the end of the day, today India is run by us, the neo-colonials. We have basically taken on the mantle of the old colonials. The system exists, the country exists, everything about government exists largely to service our needs and our privileges. All systems in that country, just like it was in the US many years ago, till the 60s saw the big change. Everything exists in India today to serve the needs of the upper classes. And the simplest way you can identify that is by seeing the incredible chasm that exists between us and the people who work in our homes. I don't think anywhere in the free world will you find this incredible disjunction between what is earned by people who work in our homes in India and what we earn. At the end of the day, we are the neo-colonials. If you are like me, a child of privilege, if you are like me, a child of an elite education, then the world exists for you. The system exists for you. At the end of the day, even though the BJP government, the NDA government ran us into the ground and closed us down, why they could not silence me and exterminate me is because at the end of the day, I come from the same class that they come from. I know the same people, I've been to the same schools, I can talk the same language. And that's the strength I have, and that's why I'm saying that it's people like you and me back home for whom the country exists. We are the neo-colonials, and the system exists for us, and that system will have to be changed. The big paradox in this, the conundrum in this is, the system has to be at the end of the day changed by the neo-colonials themselves. But why would anybody change the system that benefits themselves? So this is the conundrum on which 60 years of Indian independence has hobbled along. As I said, if you don't have it, if you don't come from this class, then you can be a victim of everything. You can be a victim of police violence, you can be a victim of street violence, you can be a victim of court violence. I mean, you are at the mercy of all the forces around you with very little to choose. But if you come from our class, you are protected and everything that is there really exists for you. And the neo-colonial has a particular, just like the colonial had a particular pathology, the neo-colonial also has a pathology. And the pathology is that he finds it very easy to tolerate violence and injustice as long as this grand idea of progress is in motion. So the neo-colonial, just as the colonial would do all across the world, not just in Asia but in Africa, everywhere, as long as this grand idea of progress, what used to be called the white man's burden, and is today our burden, is being pushed along, we are okay about injustices and violence. So you see things like Nandigram, you see battles over mines, over dams, all that is okay. Some poor people somewhere have to pay the collateral damage. They have to pay the price for this, but that's okay. There is the grand project of progress that is going on, and if people are suffering, that's all right, because it's not we who are suffering. Nobody comes to our houses in Delhi, in Greater Kailash and golf links and says, move out because we need to build a dam here, or we need to dig down here for a mine. Nobody does that. So it's perfectly fine when it happens out there to deprive people, poor people, people who are outside of this circle of the neo-colonials. And progress and violence, I can tell you, has a history that is very, very terrifying. I mean, it's not just about Gujarat, and you can see that argument in Gujarat today. I was just talking to Jafri Saab's daughter here. So you can see that in Gujarat today. People are very alright about forgetting everything that happened in 2002. Even Muslims will tell you that. Muslims in Gujarat will tell you that. Let's forget about it. Dhande ki baat hai, aage badhte hain, boss. It's a problem. Because we've decided that at the end of the day, the only yardstick is a material yardstick, is money. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, anything that impedes this grand idea of progress should be pushed aside. And we heard this in the Gujarat election from everybody. And lots of them, Muslims and some of them very prominent Muslims, who said, forget about it, let's just move on. The business of justice, fair play and all, set it aside. There is the business of money and progress, and let's get on with it. Of course, the greatest example, as we all know, is Nazi Germany. And when the Nazis were exterminating the Jews, 6 million of them going in 3 years' time. The single greatest challenge facing German technology was, how do we build incinerators that can burn bodies faster? I mean, that was the great engineering challenge facing the best minds in Germany. How do we build incinerators that will burn bodies faster? Because it was easy to kill Jews by the tens of thousands because you just gassed them. You just opened the xylem and just gassed them. But you couldn't burn them fast enough. So the finest minds in the pursuit of the grand idea of progress were working hard to engineer crematoria that could do it faster. We need to worry about people who tell us these stories. We need to worry about political leaders, about thinkers who tell us that the grand idea of progress will take collateral damage because it's being articulated by somebody who will not pay the collateral damage but expect somebody else to pay it. One ends up sounding like a doomsayer because in India, in my class, everybody only has a sense of the good times, you know. There is this favorite poem of mine which I always talk about. It's a poem by W.H. Auden, the famous poet. It's a very short poem. It's called Musée des Beaux-Arts. Musée des Beaux-Arts is just 2 stanzas. And in these 2 stanzas, Auden paints a tableau. The tableau runs something like this. Icarus, the Greek figure, in his attempt to fly up to the sun, his wings are melted and he's plunging into the ocean. As he plunges into the ocean, as he disappears into the ocean, a ship is sailing past. And on the near shore, there is a farmer plowing his fields. That's the tableau Auden paints in this short poem. The purpose of the thing is very simple. It's to tell you that horrible things happen in the most ordinary seeming circumstances. That there's an illusion of normalcy that we all live with. You know, because the newspapers keep coming, the televisions are buzzing, the planes are taking off, and there's an illusion of normalcy. We are not living in normal times. We are not living in normal times in the United States of America, and we are certainly not living in normal times in India. We are living through very difficult times. The gentleman sitting there asked me, he's not on the stage now, he asked me, is what is happening in India good or bad? And I said, I have no way of knowing. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we will look back and make a reckoning of these years, and we will know whether they were good or bad. But these are incredibly difficult and unusual times. And it's very important that we recognize, and reading not just the bold print, but also understanding the tremors that lie beneath all the movements that are taking place in India, because they are going to inalienably change the nature of our country and the way we conduct ourselves. Am I a doomsayer? Am I a nostalgist? I mean, have I been doing too much doomsaying? It's not true. I'm actually a die-hard optimist. There is no way I could have survived the Pahalgam battle between 2001 and 2004 if I were not a die-hard optimist. I mean, in those years, we were 125 people who were run down to 4 people. We had something like 24 false cases labeled against us. We were raided. 3 of my colleagues were arrested. I had a murder attempt on me. I lived under police security, which was 24 armed policemen 24 hours every day. I mean, if I had not been a die-hard optimist, I would not have survived. I would not have come back to Tehran. I would not be doing the same work. There is no reason for me to do it. The simplest thing is to turn away from it. But I am a die-hard optimist. And I'm speaking to you as a die-hard optimist. I'm not saying that we had a better India earlier. We didn't. Anybody would be a fool to imagine that India in 1947 or 1957 or 1967 was better overall than India in 2008. There have been dramatic changes, fueled by the great sort of the plinth that was laid at independence. I mean, tens of millions of scheduled castes, tens of millions of oppressed have moved up the chain, have been freed up. I remember Arif Muhammad Khan was telling me the meaning of Mayawati. This was 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, he had quit the Congress and joined Mayawati, and then he quit Mayawati and joined the BJP. But I remember him telling me, he said, Tarun, people, you can never understand what Mayawati means. He said for hundreds of years, no Dalit has even been able to walk into a police station. When a Dalit used to see the shadow of a policeman, he used to run into a gutter and hide. He said the meaning of Mayawati is that today, any Dalit can walk into a police station and register a complaint and it will be heard. So I'm not among those who believes that things have not improved. I think the processes of politics, the processes of Indian democracy have brought great change. And we must recognize that change, because in all things, things are complex. We do ourselves a disservice when we take them simply. When we just say, it's all bad or it's all good. It's never like that. It's always far more complex. The problem I have in India is that I find today that I somehow feel that we don't have a handle on our big issues. We no longer understand what the big issues are, and that despair is that I often feel that we don't have the stomach to fight the big battles anymore. And that's what I worry about, that the quality of discourse at the public level, at the national level, no longer reflects that willpower or that understanding to tackle the really big issues that are building up around us. And something of this probably has to do with the kind of very neutral moral universe that career politicians today represent in India. It's a very neutral moral universe. It's not yoked to any deep ideas of a public interest, public good, a public mission. It's really a kind of political careerism. And this kind of neutral morality creates a very dangerous space. And in this dangerous space, what we've ended up doing is, we've ended up opening up all the fault lines of Indian public life. I mean, in 1947, very, very great men sewed and closed 100 fault lines of language, fault lines of region, religion, caste, I mean, ethnicity. I mean, there were 1,000 fault lines that very, very visionary men and women closed to create the idea of India. In the last 15-20 years, we have opened up every single fault line. I mean, caste has never been a bigger issue in India than it is today. We would have imagined that in 1947 we would be working towards the elimination of the kind of oppressions of caste and the kind of absurdities of caste. Today, in 2008, caste is more important than ever before. We are seeing a huge agitation in Delhi, in Rajasthan, by the Gujars, almost close to violent agitation, where there will be police firings and deaths, by the Gujars demanding that they be declared scheduled castes. Caste is today a huge factor. I mean, Mayawati wins on caste, Lalu Yadav wins on caste, Ghulam Yadav wins on caste. Caste is still a huge factor. And every single day we find that new politicians are discovering it's a good way to go. We saw the bigotry of Narendra Modi, who crassly appealed to a very religious sectarian war. We've seen Raj Thackeray in Maharashtra now emerge and get himself a national space by actually practicing the worst kind of bigotry, by demanding that Maharashtra and Mumbai only belong to Mumbaikars. This is 2008. So politics is today playing with the idea of difference to gain advantage. Once upon a time, the idea of politics was it was meant to close differences. It was meant to find common ground. I mean, that was the grandness of a man like Gandhi. Gandhi in 1947, when the first Indian government was being sworn in on 15th August, was not even in the Parliament House. He was not even in Delhi. He was sitting in Calcutta trying to quell Hindu-Muslim riots, because he thought it was a great failure on the part of the political leadership to have ended up with a country where the two main constituents were battling it out. Because his idea of politics was that you closed differences and found common ground. But today, the idea of all politics is, how do you find a kind of difference which you can play out to gain advantage? And this is the morally neutral career politician, and the way he works himself. It's a politics that feeds on dissent. It's a politics that feeds on differences. You know, I mean, you can't have in India today. I can tell you, from the city, in fact, you have a man called Barack Obama who's trying to create a new vision for his country, an idea of change. I can tell you, you can never have a Barack Obama in India. You can never be politically engaged in India unless your caste representation is right, your community representation is right, your religious positioning is right. It's not about ideas. It's no longer about ideas, once it was. It's about what grouping you represent. And it is a big problem, because when politics ceases, when it's bleached out of ideas, when it's bleached out of idealism, then it's only a corrupt way of manipulating institutions and individuals. That's what it boils down to beyond a point. And what it leads to really is a public discourse of lies and a public discourse of a great deal of noise. We've seen that in America. We've seen those 8 George Bush years. we've seen a public discourse which has been full of all kind of prevarications and lies, and it has led the world to ruin. It's not just America. It's been a disastrous thing. This politics of lies, of prevarications, of noise, where noise obliterates good sense, is happening in India all the time, and a lot of that has to do with the kind of political atmosphere and the immoral politics that's come into being. What do we have going for us? While I've been telling you about all the problems, what do we have going for us? I think the single greatest thing we have going for us is the Constitution of India. I'm almost certain that very few of you have even dipped into the Constitution of India, but it's an extraordinary document. It's one of the greatest public documents in the world, crafted by some of the most extraordinary leaders who have ever lived. It's a noble document, it addresses the most noble in the human spirit, and it is still our greatest safeguard. So we have a great Constitution. And even today, when civil rights activists start speaking up and wanting to act, it's the Constitution that they reach for. Because the Constitution still is a kind of beacon in bad times for us. It's a very important plinth. It's the plinth on which we rest ourselves. Then there's the whole idea of electoral democracy. The electoral democracy has worked. It has brought change in all kinds of ways. It has changed the old order, and it works. The electoral democracy takes place. There are many problems with the democracy, but we do have elections, reasonably free and fair elections, and seamless transfer of power. These are things we got going for us. Then I think it's people like you and me. I think people like you and me who were somewhere lyrically married to the idea of India. You know, all of us would go and do what we do in our lives and not be here to either put together money or listen to boring speeches by people from India. And we could just go and do what we want, but somewhere within us, as I find within myself, I find it impossible for myself to even leave the country ever since I was a young man. I had the scholarship to go to Rhodes when I was just out of college, and I chose to be a journalist and not go there, to Oxford. Because a lot of us are still lyrically wed to the idea of India as first enjoined, enshrined, thought out by the founding fathers. And that's very difficult to place, but India is full of people like you and me, I'll tell you. People who believe in the idea of India. People who believe in a syncretic culture. People who believe in the fact that we are all imbued with a certain, the subcontinent is imbued with a certain kind of soul into which we are all a part. And we are, as I said, the third big thing that we got going for ourselves is just like people like you and me. And finally, the plinth that the founding fathers have left us, the plinth of the country. The founding fathers were extraordinary. The kind of vision they had for India was extraordinary. And I can tell you, all that's good about India still goes back to the vision of the founding fathers, and that's the other great thing. There's a story I'll quickly tell you, which I often repeat because I just love that story. It again has to do with Gandhi and Nehru. The first part of the story really is that when Nehru came back and came back to India, his father Motilal was one of the richest lawyers in India. I mean, they were very wealthy. He was in Allahabad. They had this massive mansion, what is now Anand Bhavan. They had Rolls Royces. They had silver cutlery on the tables. The most powerful men of pre-independence India dined on his table. And he had sent his son to Harrow. He had sent him to Cambridge. That's Jawaharlal. Jawaharlal comes back to India. And the moment he comes back to India, which is in 1918, 1919, he falls under the spell of Gandhi straight away. Motilal is absolutely distraught. He does not want his only child, his only son, to become a freedom fighter in the mold of Gandhi and give his entire life up to it. So he actually meets Mohandas Gandhi, he meets Mahatma Gandhi, Motilal does, and he tells him, please dissuade my son from following you. And Gandhi actually says, yes, I will. Thanks. Of course, Jawaharlal is not to be dissuaded. Jawaharlal by then has had a very similar experience. Jawaharlal has actually visited a few villages in the outskirts of Allahabad. And he has seen the unbelievable poverty of peasant India, the abject poverty of peasant India, and it has moved him very deeply. But what he has also seen is a twofold thing. He has also seen the incredible generosity, because when he goes there to these huts to meet these village people, he finds that at every hut, though people have nothing to eat and nothing to drink, they pull together everything they have to give it to him because he's a visitor. So he's very moved, and that is a seminal experience of Jawaharlal's life. So he's not to be dissuaded. By then Jawaharlal started publishing a newspaper from Lucknow. And this newspaper is every day attacking the British. Jallianwala Bagh has happened, so he's aggressively attacking the British. Motilal by now is quite certain that one of these days his son is going to get arrested. The British officers of the area tell Motilal that. They said either you get your son to pipe down,
or we will have no choice. Motilal tries. He tries to convince young Jawaharlal from eschewing the kind of journalism he is doing. But Jawaharlal by then is too much his own man and not to be dissuaded. So what does Motilal Nehru do? It's a beautiful story as part of the biography. Every single night, Motilal Nehru starts going to his bedroom and latching the door from inside. And instead of sleeping on his plush four-poster, he begins to sleep on the floor. Because he understands that it's only a matter of time before he's arrested and he's put into prison, so he wants to see what it is to sleep on the floor. And sure enough, within 3 months, Jawaharlal Nehru is arrested, and 2 months later, Motilal Nehru is also arrested. I mean, I'm telling you this story to tell you the kind of people who shaped the idea of India. These were men of immense privilege, immense elitism, who gave up a great deal to shape the idea of India. And that's why I keep saying the founding fathers of India have no parallel in the history of the world. No parallel. If you read the writings of the founding fathers, if you read the stories of the founding fathers, they are far more spectacular than the founding fathers of this country. Please understand that overnight, they decreed, Nehru and his gang decreed a modern, liberal, democratic, secular country which was coming out of almost 300 years of colonialism and feudalism. It's an extraordinary act. It has no parallel. And because they were so robust, because they were genuinely noble, they created a plinth that has survived. We have seen the same kind of post-colonial countries come to grief. All around, look all around India, look at Africa, look at Asia. All the post-colonial countries have lapsed from the democratic ideals and the liberal ideals. India has not. Even though India has more problems than all of them put together. And that has to do with the original founding vision. It's something we have to be thankful for always. What do we need? I said, what do we have going for us? What do we need? I think what we need in a huge way is a New Deal. You know, in America they had a New Deal in the 1960s. What we need is not so much an economic New Deal, which was the New Deal in America. I think what we need is a general consensus on the kind of politics we will not practice and the kind of politics we will practice. I really hope I can go and start drumming up this idea more and more among people so it gains some traction. Because we really need a New Deal. The political parties need to say, we will not do certain kinds of politics. Certain kinds of things are just beyond the pale of national interest, we will not practice them. Today it's politics of recrimination, it's a politics of a great deal of virulence. We need to get into a kind of politics that allows us to start talking to each other. And this New Deal, I think the most important thing about this New Deal will have to be a lowering of the voice. I find that in the project of modernity, it's the most important thing we need to do. We need to lower our voice. We are all too shrill. We are all too noisy. We are always ratcheting up the volume. Modernity demands that we all live together. Different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different community groups, different people with different ideas about what a good life is. I mean, we are all becoming melting pots. And it becomes very important that in a melting pot, we all learn to ratchet our volume down. We learn to speak with a soft voice. It's very easy to get shriller and shriller with each other. I mean, every community can dig in its heels, every religious group can dig in its heels, and there's no going forward. I think it's a disaster. Modernity will demand that we live with each other, and if we're going to live with each other, we need to build a soft voice. We need to tone it down. But in India itself, I feel that we need to marry the values of modernity and Western liberalism, which are very important values. They're fundamental human values around human rights. But we need to reinvent them in some kind of an Indian idiom. There is a way of doing it in an Indian idiom. Gandhi taught us that. He did it in an idiom. And I think even now, it's a big challenge in front of us. How do we reinvent this, the use of Western values and the ideas of Western liberal democracies in an Indian idiom? We need a vocabulary and climate of inspiration. We lack it totally, and we need a visionary leadership. These are issues. Visionary leaderships make a big difference. We've seen what Mandela did for South Africa. I visited South Africa several times. I can tell you, without a man called Nelson Mandela, South Africa would have been torn apart in civil war. I mean, there would have been a bloodbath going on, bloodbaths. One man's grace saved South Africa. So that kind of visionary, as we know, one man's mistakes in this country have created havoc. It's really about visionary leadership. I can tell you that. No, it is really about that. I mean, we underestimate leadership. Leadership is a big thing. And a vocabulary, a kind of vocabulary. Our public vocabulary has declined. When our public vocabulary consists of things like either you're against us or with us and stuff like that, we are really hitting rock bottom. I mean, public discourse has to. I mean, we are what we say. We are what we speak. We are how we articulate ourselves. If we lose the ability to articulate ourselves in a finer way, we cease to be finer people. And these are things that we need in a big way in India too, where public discourse, I have to say, has plummeted to a large extent. Just the last few things, how to move. We all know these things. There are many of these things I've said are very banal. We understand them instinctively. The problem always becomes, how do you move? Even Gandhi, when he came to India, when Gandhi came back to India in 1915, he landed in Bombay and he looked at the subcontinent and he was paralyzed. He couldn't believe the size. He had come from South Africa, from a small ashram which used to run there. He lands in Bombay, looks at the incredible spread of the subcontinent and he's paralyzed. He doesn't know how to move. So he goes to Gokhale and he asks Gokhale. Gokhale is his mentor. And he says, what do I do? And what does Gokhale tell him to do? He says, travel by train, travel by third class. So for 1 year in 1916, Gandhi just travels. And he keeps doing that. He still doesn't know how to move. Till he finally discovers the indigo plantation strike. And he says, okay, let me go there and see what I can do. So how to move is always a problem. What we are doing here, deliberating, whether it's Rashid Bhai or all of you here, is what we are deliberating is how do we move? I mean, even when you have intention, intent is a big thing, it changes the world. But even when you have intent, you still need to understand what to do with that intent. How do you move? And that's what we are. And I think one of the things we can do is by learning to listen. I think we don't listen enough. I think we all need to learn to listen. And that's a big thing. And out of that listening, just like Gandhi traveled, I think we need to learn to listen and we need to learn to participate. We engage. This is about engagement. And that's why I feel good being here. This is truly about engagement and it's about listening. I think those are two very critical things in teaching us how to move. There are two things that can undo India completely. The first is inequality. I have a real problem with the inequality situation in India. It's gross. I mean, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. It's a really bad situation there, I can tell you. And the way I see us evolving, I can see that individually we will continue to flourish. I will flourish, you will flourish, people individually, Indians will flourish. But as a collective, we are not making the same kind of pledges to progress that we should have, that the European countries did. We are not doing that as a collective. Collectively, we are still in trouble. So inequality is the first one that can undo us completely, and the second is bigotry. I think bigotry of any kind, religious bigotry, class bigotry, any bigotry is problematic. And then we need to really worry about that. We need tolerance. So we need tolerance. The two things we need in response to these two things is we need tolerance, lots of tolerance, heck loads of tolerance, and we also need a coalition of the concerned. So what my friends here are trying to do is create a coalition of the concerned. You know, few people can change things, but the more and more you coalesce with people who are like you, who believe in the right things, you end up making a difference. I was invited to the Urdu Press Club some months ago for a conversation on my investigation. I was a little late arriving there. This was in Delhi. When I arrived at the press club, there was all hell breaking loose. It was a packed hall, and a right-wing Hindu commentator was speaking from the podium, and the young Muslim boys in the audience had gone berserk. I mean, some of them had jumped onto the podium and they yanked his mic up, and there were people shouting and screaming all over the place. And I spoke right after that, and I said, I'm really disappointed that they chose to come to address this gathering here. I said, we can't do this. You cannot demand a liberal world if you are not willing to concede a liberal world. It's axiomatic. If you wish to persuade, then you should be willing to be persuaded. I mean, it's axiomatic. It should be axiomatic for every person, for the children, for your parents, that if you wish to persuade, you should be willing to be persuaded. I mean, you cannot have this kind of real liberal atmosphere that happens. And I can tell you, everybody did pretty much button down. And the rest of the evening went off smoothly. So we really have to learn to put up, to kind of just tone things down a lot more than we choose to do so, and answers will begin to come out of that. Nehru made two famous speeches within 6 months. One was on August 15, 1947, and the second one was January 30th, 1948. In the first speech, he spoke about India's tryst with destiny, and in his second speech, he spoke about Gandhi's assassination, and he said the light has gone out of our lives. Those two things, which Nehru spoke about between August 47 and January 30th, 1948, I think are still true and hold good. We have a great tryst with destiny, but the light also keeps going in our lives for a lot many of us. We have to find a way between these two very difficult poles. Thank you for having me here.